A few years ago, biologists went out onto the Illinois River near Joliet hoping to catch nothing. They nearly did. 1 hour of dragging nets and they pulled up 3 fish. 3. In water that, a decade before, had been so thick with carp the fish threw themselves out of the river and into passing boats. These are silver and bighead carp, and for years they were treated as unkillable. A fish with no answer. Then, quietly, along certain stretches of the river, the millions began to thin. The easy answer was the nets. People hauling them out by the ton. But while that was happening, something slipped back into this water that the state of Illinois had declared extinct half a century ago. And people started saying it was the reason the carp were vanishing. So here's the question this whole story turns on. Where did the millions go? And is anything down there really eating them? The carp did not sneak into the country. We brought them on purpose and then we lost them. In the early 1970s, catfish farmers across the American South, first in Arkansas, imported silver and bighead carp from Asia to do a job. The fish were living filters. They strained algae and plankton out of murky farm ponds and kept the water clean, cheaply, without chemicals. For a while, it worked exactly as planned. Then the rivers rose. Through the flood years of the 1990s, water spilled over the banks of those southern ponds and carried the carp out into the Mississippi. And a filter feeder that breeds fast in a river system that runs across most of a continent does not stay put. They moved north, up the Mississippi, into the Missouri, into the Illinois. A single female can carry more than 1 million eggs. There is no native predator here that grew up beside them, nothing that learned over thousands of years how to hunt them. So they did what any animal does in a place with endless food and nothing to eat it. They multiplied until they became the river. By some estimates from the National Wildlife Federation, silver and bighead carp came to make up as much as 97% of the living weight in certain stretches of the Illinois and the Mississippi. Not 97% of the fish you might want to catch. 97% of everything alive in the water, measured by mass. A grown one can reach 4 feet and 100 pounds. In those stretches, the river had been turned almost entirely into one animal, and silver and bighead are only half of the problem. They belong to a group of 4 invasive carp brought over together. Grass carp mow down the underwater plants that shelter native young. Black carp crush snails and native mussels, some of the most endangered animals on the continent, in their throats. But it was the silver and the bighead that rewired the Illinois, because they feed the way a whale does, straining tiny drifting plankton through comb-like gill rakers by the ton. That plankton is the base of everything. Take it, and the native fish that depend on it when they are larvae simply have less to grow on. The carp did not only crowd the river, they ate the bottom out from under it. You have probably seen the videos even if you never went looking for them. A boat opens its throttle and the whole surface erupts. Dozens of silver bodies in the air at once, some of them 10 feet up. It looks like a special effect. It is not. A silver carp panics at the vibration of a motor, and a grown one, 20, 30, 40 pounds, comes down like a thrown cinder block. On the 30th of July, 2022, a man named Rich Russell was idling back toward a boat landing on the Wisconsin River with his 9-year-old son in the bow. A silver carp came out of the water, 35 inches long, 20 pounds, and struck the boy across the arm and the side. The father pinned the fish to the floor of the boat with his foot while it thrashed, and tried to keep his son calm. Nobody had done anything to that carp. It was simply there, and the boat was loud. In a town called Bath, Illinois, people gave up fighting the leaping and turned it into a festival. The Redneck Fishing Tournament. No rods. You take a boat into the swarm and catch the carp with nets and buckets in your bare hands out of the air while they rain down around you. It is a party built on the back of an invasion nobody could stop. Everything tried against them either failed or barely held. You cannot poison a whole working river without killing everything else in it. You cannot build a fence out of water. Sound cannons, bubble curtains, contract netting. They slow the carp. They do not stop them. For 30 years, the only honest description of the situation was that the carp were winning. And the single realistic goal had shrunk to one thing: keep them out of Lake Michigan. That is the animal we are talking about. Now hold on to that number 3, the 3 fish in an hour, because it is about to become very hard to explain. For a long time, the story of the carp was only ever about how many there were, and how nobody could bring the number down. Then the numbers started coming down. Along the upper Illinois River, the part closest to Chicago and to Lake Michigan, the counts began to fall. One estimate put the drop at around 68%. That survey near Joliet, the one that pulled up 3 carp in an hour, was not a fluke. The biologist running it said out loud what everyone in the boat already suspected. There just aren't many here anymore. And there was a clean, satisfying explanation, one that held up for years. People ate them out. It sounds like a joke. It was a strategy. Illinois sits at the last gate before the Great Lakes, and the state has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on electric barriers, one of them strung across the canal about 37 miles from Lake Michigan, humming under the water to turn the fish back before they reach a multi-billion-dollar fishery. But the cheapest weapon turned out to be an appetite. If commercial fishermen could sell the carp, they would catch the carp endlessly for money. The problem was the name. Nobody wants to order Asian carp for dinner. So in June of 2022, the state simply renamed it. They called it Copi, short for copious, because there were so many and they built a whole supply chain to sell it as food. A mild, lean white fish with a friendlier name on the menu. The rebrand worked in a way almost nothing else had. In the years before it, commercial crews were pulling roughly 7 or 8 million pounds of these carp out of the Illinois River every year. After the new name, that number climbed to 15 or 16 million pounds a year. Across the whole removal effort, working the river pool by pool since around 2010, crews have now taken out more than 46 million pounds of invasive carp. Millions of fish, netted, iced, and hauled away for good. Most of it never reaches a plate. It is ground into fish meal, into pet food, into fertilizer, into whatever will move the tonnage. So, there it is. The mystery solved before it started. The carp are thinning in the upper river because thousands of tons of them are being physically dragged out by people in boats. Where did the millions go? Into nets, into trucks, onto plates. That is the answer that held. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, the quiet ones about what is actually living in the water near you, subscribing is the easiest way to catch the next one when it goes up. But that answer has a hole in it. Because the nets explain the fish that got pulled out. They do not explain the fish that never grew up. And they do not explain the thing that came back. Because while the nets were doing their work in the open, something was happening underneath that almost nobody was watching. An animal was coming home. Its name is the alligator gar. And if you have never heard of it, that is close to the whole point. The alligator gar is the largest fish native to the state of Illinois, and the second largest freshwater fish anywhere in North America, behind only the white sturgeon. A big one can pass 300 pounds and stretch to the length of a small car. It has a long, broad, tooth-filled snout that gives it its name, 2 rows of teeth in the upper jaw, and a body sheathed in ganoid scales. An interlocking armor so hard and so enamel-slick that native peoples once shaped the scales into arrowheads. And it is old, not the individual fish, the design. The alligator gar has come down almost unchanged for more than 100 million years, since the age of the dinosaurs. It can breathe air, gulping it at the surface through a lung-like swim bladder, which lets it survive in warm, low-oxygen backwaters where other fish would suffocate. Inside, it carries a spiral valve intestine, the same primitive gut a shark has. A study published in 2024 found it has one of the slowest rates of evolution of any animal with a backbone. The reptile it is named for, the American alligator, is a newcomer by comparison. The gar's line was already ancient tens of millions of years before the first alligator ever crawled into a swamp. Even its eggs are armored in their own way, laced with a toxin that sickens almost anything that tries to eat them. When you look at an alligator gar, you are looking at something a Cretaceous river would recognize. The biggest one ever recorded gives you the scale of what these fish can become. On Valentine's Day, 2011, a commercial fisherman named Kenny Williams was pulling his last net of the day out of Choddard Lake in Mississippi when it caught on what he thought was a log. It took him half an hour to wrestle the thing into his boat. It was an alligator gar, 8 feet, 5 inches long, 327 pounds with a girth close to 4 feet around. Biologists later estimated the fish was about 95 years old, which means it had been swimming that river since the years of the First World War, and had simply never been caught. Now here's why this matters to the carp. For most of the 20th century, we hated this fish. States branded it a trash fish, a nuisance, a threat to the base and the catfish people actually wanted, and they ran deliberate campaigns to wipe it out. There were bounties, there were tournaments whose only purpose was to kill as many gar as possible and stack them on the bank. The largest one ever taken on rod and reel, a fish of 279 pounds, was landed in Texas in 1951, at a time when killing it was treated as a public service. In Illinois, the campaign worked. The last alligator gar anyone documented in the state was caught in the Cache River, down in the far south, in 1966. After that, nothing. By the 1990s, it was considered gone from Illinois entirely, extinct within the state lines. And then, starting around 2010, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began quietly putting it back. They raised young gar in hatcheries, growing each one to at least a foot long before release, so it had some chance of surviving its first year, and put them into places like the Kaskaskia River and into restored backwaters along the Illinois, working with the Nature Conservancy to reconnect the flooded, weedy shallows the fish needs to breed. Some of those releases went into floodplain preserves with names like Emiquon and Spunky Bottoms, backwaters the Conservancy had spent years stitching back onto the main river. The federal effort now reaches across 13 states of the gar's old range, all of them trying to return a giant to water it had been scrubbed out of. In 2019, the state even wrote it a protection rule. 1 gar per angler per day, no commercial harvest at all. A law to guard the same animal it had once tried to exterminate. You can already feel where this story wants to go. A river drowning in an invasive fish nobody can kill, and an ancient armored native predator, big enough to eat almost anything that swims, returning to that exact water at that exact moment. In 2016, the Illinois legislature passed a resolution that called the alligator gar the only native species capable of eating adult Asian carp. A gar expert in Louisiana put the mood into a single question. What else, she asked, is going to eat those monster carp? Nobody, she said, had found another way to bring them under control. The headlines wrote themselves. A monster to fight a monster. Nature sending its oldest soldier back into the fight. It is a beautiful story. The people who actually manage the fish have spent years trying to take it apart, because the moment those headlines appeared, the biologists at the Illinois DNR started saying, as plainly as they could, that it was not true. The gar, they insisted, was never brought back to control the carp. The state's chief of fisheries at the time put it bluntly. The stockings had nothing to do with Asian carp. They would have, in his words, no effect on the carp population. The point was only ever to undo an old extinction, to return a native giant to water it belonged in, and someday to give anglers a spectacular fish to chase. To be fair to the fish, it does eat carp. An alligator gar is an opportunistic hunter that mostly takes whatever is most abundant around it, and in the Illinois River, for years, the most abundant thing by far has been carp. Biologists who flush the stomachs of young stocked gar have pulled carp out of them, so the gar does not ignore the invader, it just cannot come close to keeping up with it. And when you look at the arithmetic, you see why he was so careful. Between 2010 and 2013, the state stocked around 6,000 young alligator gar. Of those, only about 1,500 were large enough to survive being released. 1,500 fish scattered across a river system where the carp were once measured in tons per single mile of water. It is, in the flat words of one summary, a drop in the bucket. it gets slower than that. A female alligator guard takes about 11 years to reach the age where she can even reproduce. 11 years before the returning population can begin to replace itself. This is an animal that lives on the time scale of human generations, dropped into an emergency that moves at the speed of a flood. So the clean answer breaks. The gyar is real. Its return is real. But a few thousand slow-growing fish did not eat 46 million pounds of carp, and the biologists have been begging people to understand that for a decade, which leaves us back at the same water, near Joliet, with the same 3 fish in the net, and a worse version of the original question. If the nets pulled out the adults, and the ancient predator everyone credited is still too rare and too slow to matter, then what happened to all the young? What is eating the carp that never make it to the net? There are a few possible answers. None of them is comfortable. The first is the plainest and maybe the bleakest. It really is mostly us. The decline in the upper river tracks almost exactly with the money and the crews thrown at removal, the Copi market, the contracts, the incentives. Which would mean the quiet in that Dresden Island pool is not the river healing. It is a machine running. A suppression that lasts precisely as long as the funding and the fishing pressure last, and not one season longer. Ease off, and the carp pour back in to fill the space. Those million egg females spawn more than once in a single season, and their young can be breeding within a couple of years. The river refills faster than almost anything alive in it can eat. Under this answer, nothing is eating the carp. We are, and only for as long as we keep paying to. The second answer is stranger, and it flips the whole invasion on its head. The river may be teaching its own natives to hunt the newcomer. In the summer of 2014, after a huge carp spawn on the lower Illinois, researchers from Western Illinois University and the U.S. Geological Survey caught nearly 1,500 native predator fish and looked inside their stomachs. What they found was young Asian carp everywhere, in largemouth bass, in white bass and crappie, in short-nosed gar and freshwater drum. The gar were a telling case because they feed at the surface, and the young carp school right along the shorelines where the gar hunt, so the two kept meeting. In flathead catfish, the huge native catfish that swallows prey whole, can itself pass 50 pounds and stays big enough to keep taking carp long after the young ones have outgrown everything else. Channeled catfish were the standout. 39% of the ones they checked had eaten a juvenile carp. Even the birds had joined in, white pelicans and eagles picking young carp off the surface. One of the researchers put it simply: there were millions of these little fish around, so it would be weird for something not to eat them. And they were not just swallowing them by accident. A later study of largemouth bass in the same reach found young silver carp in nearly a fifth of the bass that had eaten any fish at all. And the bigger the bass, the bigger the carp it took. What made that strange is the math underneath it. Those young carp were only about 9% of the small fish available that season, which means the predators were seeking them out, choosing them, more often than random chance would explain. For a moment, that sounds like the answer the whole story was reaching for. The natives are fighting back. But it is right here that the scientists stop and put their hands up and refuse to say the comfortable thing, because a silver carp grows fast. It sprints through the narrow window when it is small enough to be swallowed, and out the other side, and once it clears its size, almost nothing left in the river can touch it. The natives are eating an enormous number of young carp and still not denting the population because the carp simply outgrow their predators. The predation is real. Whether it controls anything, nobody will claim. The third answer is the one that asks for patience. Nobody has. It says the gar, and the giant flatheads, and the whole slowly reassembling cast of native hunters are not the answer today, but they might be the answer in 30 years. An apex predator does not reseed itself in a river in a single season. It does it across decades, one long generation at a time, and 11 years to maturity means the alligator gar experiment will not give up its verdict until sometime in the 2040s. The uncomfortable part is that this answer cannot be tested yet. The people who started it may not live to see how it ends. They are, in a real sense, stocking a river for their grandchildren and hoping. If you have ever pulled something strange out of a river you thought you knew, or watch the water do something it was not supposed to do, I would be glad to read it down in the comments. This particular story is being written by a lot of people paying attention to small things, and this is the honest center of it. Nobody can tell you, with hard numbers, how much of the carp collapse in the upper Illinois is nets, how much is native predators, and how much is simply the boom and bust rhythm of an invasive population that overshot its own food supply and crashed the way overshooting populations always do. There is even a fourth possibility folded inside the other three, quieter and harder to prove. That the carp, having stripped their own food supply bare in the places they hit first and hardest, are partly just crashing the way any population crashes when it overshoots what the water can feed, and the timing of the gar's return only makes it look like something hunted them down. A boom, and then a bust, dressed up after the fact as a rescue. The counts keep moving. The leading edge of the carp keeps pressing toward Lake Michigan, held back by an electric barrier and a wall of contracted nets. In the lower pools, downstream, the carp are still thick, still spawning, still leaping into boats. The quiet stretch near Joliet is a quiet stretch, not a solved river. Pull the crews off it for 2 seasons and no one is sure it would stay quiet. And the alligator gar, the fish the whole legend was built around, is still out there in numbers too small and growing too slowly for anyone to say what it will finally come to mean. So go back to that boat near Joliet, and the 3 fish in the net and the biologists who came out hoping to catch nothing. Here's what that empty water is really about. Not a monster killed by a bigger monster. That was always the easy version. The one we reached for because we wanted the story to be simple. What is actually down there is slower and harder to see than any weapon. A river, half broken by a century of dams and poisons, and 1 filter fish we let loose by accident, quietly trying to put its old pieces back where they belong. Right now, in the Kaskaskia, alligator gar that had not existed in this state since the 60s are drifting near the surface, breathing air, growing an inch at a time toward a size the Cretaceous would recognize. In the lower pools of the Illinois, flathead catfish are lying in the dark under the banks, swallowing young carp whole. And in a hatchery somewhere, the next batch of gar is being raised to a length just barely large enough to survive, for a river that will not hand back its answer for another 20 years. They were here before the locks and the barges and the names on the maps. Some of them were here in almost this exact shape, before there were rivers like these at all. And they are back in the water now, under the quiet, doing the one thing an old predator has always done with time. Waiting. And if this was the kind of thing you were after, the video already on your screen is one YouTube is betting you will want next.